Another assertion that you will hear from those who are against men having multiple wives is they will say that this practice originated with the bloodline of Cain, with Cain's descendant named Lamech. And they are making that association in order to say that it's wicked or it's evil. So we're going to address that. Here in Genesis chapter 4, starting at verse 11, this is after Cain killed his brother Abel. And the Most High is speaking to Cain. He says, "And now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand." Verse 12 says, "When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth." And Cain said unto the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid, and I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And it shall come to pass that everyone that findeth me shall slay me." So as we see here, Cain is worried about others who he will come across killing him. Verse 15 says, "And the Lord said unto him, Therefore whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, and dwelt in the land of Nod, on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch. And he built a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch." So again, as we can see from verse 14 and 15, Cain feared that he would come across others who would kill him. This is because at this time, his relatives had already began to proliferate throughout the earth. That's also why in verse 17, you see that Cain had a wife. Where did he get his wife from? We were not told about his wife's mother and his wife's father and his wife's ancestry. Again, as I already stated, it's because Cain's relatives, the descendants of Adam and Eve, had already began to proliferate at this time. So keep that in mind. I'm going to go over that a little more here in a few minutes, but keep that in mind as we progress in this chapter. Continuing on in the same chapter, we left off at verse 17, so starting at verse 18 here. "And unto Enoch was born Irad, and Irad begat Mehuael, and Mehuael begat Methusael, and Methusael begat Lamech." Verse 19 says, "And Lamech took unto him two wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah. And Ada bare Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle." And verse 21 says, "And his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of such as handled the harp and organ." And then verse 22 says, "And Zillah, she also bare Tubal Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. And the sister of Tubal Cain was Naamah." So notice here how in verse 19 it mentions the fact that Lamech had two wives. And then it goes on to tell you who their sons were, the sons of these two women. And then it tells you details about their sons, how their sons were the originators of certain trades, of certain practices. So his wives, his two wives that were mentioned, are relevant to the story that's being told to you. That's why they're mentioned. Also, I want you to notice how in verse 20, it says, I'll read it again. It says, and Ada bare Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle. In other words, what it's telling you is that Jabal was the originator of dwelling in tents and having cattle, or you could say livestock. It's telling you that he was the originator of this, that this came from him. So because here in verse 20, it says that he was the father of such as dwell in tents and of such as have cattle, does that mean that it's a sin to dwell in tents and to have cattle or livestock? Because it must be a sin, because he is a descendant of Cain. He is the son of Lamech. Right, so we're using the same logic that they use about having multiple wives. Again, it just told you that he was the father, that Jabal was the father of such as dwell in tents and such as have cattle. So he's the originator of this, having livestock and dwelling in tents. That's what that means. So is that a sin? Is it a sin to dwell in tents? Is it a sin to have livestock? Of course it's not. So the logic that they're using about Lamech having multiple wives, when you're intellectually honest and you continue with the same logic, you can't just pick and choose what you want. Continue with the same logic, you would have to say that it's a sin to live in tents and to have cattle or livestock. And notice also in verse 21, it says, and his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all such as handled the harp and organ. And where it says harp here, you could say lyre, which is an instrument that was used in ancient times. So Jubal was the father of that, which means he was the originator or the pioneer of playing the lyre. So is that a sin? Is it a sin to play that instrument? That's a question. Is that a sin? Because again, he's a descendant of Cain, right? So if he did it and it's telling you that he was the originator of it, he was the father of it, then it has to be a sin. But if that doesn't have to be a sin, then it doesn't have to be a sin for Lamech to have two wives. Also, I want you to notice how in verse 19, it says Lamech took unto him two wives. But it does not say that Lamech was the father of such as had two wives, does it? It doesn't say that he was the father of having two wives or the father of having multiple wives. Even though in the next few verses it tells you that his sons were the father of certain things. So it's not telling you that he was the originator of that. Remember, Adam and Eve's descendants were already proliferating at this time. That's why Cain was able to have a wife, because there were already other people in the earth. That's why Cain was afraid that others would kill him, because there were already other people in the earth. So how can you say, honestly, that Lamech was the first person to have two wives? You can't say that. You simply cannot say that. For example, in Genesis chapter 7, it explains to you that Noah had an ark, which was a very large boat or ship. Does that mean that Noah was the first person to ever create a boat? Think about that for a second. Because here in verse 19, it says Lamech had two wives. People who hate polygyny will say that, oh, you see, it comes from the bloodline of Cain. That means it's wrong. Even though they're not saying that dwelling in tents is wrong, or having cattle, as it says in verse 20, that Jabal was the father of. And then in verse 21, it says that Jubal was the father of handling the harp, or you could say the lyre, and it says organ. They're not saying doing that's a sin. Right, so Noah in Genesis chapter 7, he built a boat. Does that mean he was the first person to ever build a boat? Absolutely not. Just because he was the first person mentioned in the Bible to build a boat does not mean that he was the first person that ever did it. And then in verses 23 and 24, it says, And Lamech said unto his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech. For I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, but truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. So his wives are relevant to the story. They're pertinent to the story that's being told here. They are the mothers of these men who were pioneers in specific trades, in playing certain instruments, etc. And he was talking to them when he made this statement that he made. That's why they're mentioned. This is Genesis 4, starting at verse 25. We left off at verse 24. And it's important to understand some things here. So it says, And Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son, and called his name Seth. For God, said she, hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. So Seth was a replacement, so to speak, for Abel. And then verse 26 says, And to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. So it says, then men began to call upon the name of the Most High. And that's because Seth was the chosen seed. He was the seed through which the chosen bloodline would come. Noah, Shem, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Christ, the prophets, they would all come through the lineage of Seth. So the reason why the story of Cain and Abel was told to us is for our learning. Nowhere does it say that Cain and Abel were Adam and Eve's first children, nor does it say that they were Adam and Eve's only children. Very important to understand. The reason why we were told that story is to teach us lessons. And then it tells us about Seth, because as I already mentioned, through Seth would come the chosen bloodline. That's why here in Genesis chapter 5, starting at verse 1, it says, This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him. So it's about to give us the generations of Adam. What you're going to notice here in this chapter is that it is not going to mention Cain. What you're going to notice here in this chapter is that it is not going to mention Abel. Why? Because it's not telling you the names or accounting for the names of all of Adam and Eve's children. It's simply not doing it. What it's doing is giving you the chosen bloodline. Verse 2 says, male and female created he them and blessed them, and called their name Adam in the day when they were created. Verse 3 says, and Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness and after his image, and called his name Seth. So you see, Seth was after his likeness and after his image. Seth was the chosen seed. And you also notice how in verse 3 it says he lived 130 years before he even begat Seth, which means that since we know that Adam was created a grown man, and being that Eve was created likely very early on, he would have had 130 years to have children. In the span of 130 years, Adam can have multiple generations of descendants. Do the math. Again, he was created a grown man. So that's why Cain was afraid that others would kill him. Because the others were who? They were his relatives. His relatives that had began to proliferate throughout the earth. And they would hear word that Cain killed his brother Abel. They would hear that through the grapevine. And they would kill him. That's what he was afraid of. And we also know that Cain had a wife. And his wife was a descendant of Adam and Eve. That's why in Genesis chapter 3, verse 20, it tells you that Eve was the mother of all living. That means everyone descends from Eve. Just like in Tobit 8, verse 6, chapter 8, verse 6, it tells you that all mankind come from Adam and Eve. Notice how in verse 4 here it says, and the days of Adam after he had begotten Seth were 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters. So Adam had other sons and daughters that were not mentioned by name. And then they had children, and their children had children, and they began to proliferate throughout the earth. So again, here in Genesis 5, when you read the whole chapter, it will go from Adam to Noah and his 3 sons, Japheth, Shem, and Ham. And it's giving you the chosen lineage from Adam through Seth. And then again, it goes to Noah and his sons. And it is the same bloodline that you read about in Luke chapter 3. That goes from Adam to Christ, Adam to Mashiach. Why? Because that's the chosen bloodline through Seth. In fact, if you read Luke chapter 3, verses 36 through 38, it's going to give you the same bloodline that you read here in Genesis chapter 5. At the end of this chapter, Genesis chapter 5, it mentions Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But in Luke chapter 3, it's not going to mention Ham and Japheth because they're not relevant, because they are not of that chosen bloodline that Luke chapter 3 is giving you. But again, in Luke chapter 3, verses 36 through 38, you're going to read about the same bloodline that you read about here, minus Ham and Japheth. So what is the point? The point is that Adam and Eve had many descendants before Lamech was even born. Again, that's why Cain was afraid to be killed by other people, and that's why Cain was able to have a wife. So you cannot say that Lamech was the first man with multiple wives, because the Bible doesn't say that.